Hi, everybody. I hope you had a relaxing spring break. We are back and we're getting started on the heart, the cardiovascular system. So the other part of the circulatory system. So technically the circulatory system includes both the lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system. So just getting technical on you here for your information. We're going to be doing cardiovascular, pretty much, and then respiratory system for exam 3. Speaking of exams, exam 2, we had a very high average on the lecture exam, around a 90%. And the lab exam was abysmal. The average was a 50%. So if you feel like you did terrible on that, you weren't the only one. I wrote a lot of comments for you guys about contacting me about study strategies. I only had one person so far come back with, you know, wanting to look at how they can do better for exam 3. So I wrote an email back and I liked it so much that I made it into an announcement. So your most recent announcement, hopefully you got an email about this. This is basically me breaking down how I would make a study strategy. This is really good info for any class, you know, not just this one. So this is not like specific towards anatomy and physiology. This is like how to study, period. And the sooner you get this down, the sooner you get the self-discipline down, the scheduling and what types of studying are best for your brain down, the sooner that you're going to have a much easier time studying. You can exercise your brain just like your muscles. You can make it stronger and stronger specifically at this skill. And it's going to be something you can carry with you for the rest of your life. So again, I'm going to reiterate, please take a look at the very least, take a look at this most recent announcement. You know, the previous announcement, which I have linked here within that announcement, where I had some study resources and tips here. This video, check that out. This video, check this out. Those will both help you, you know, get you on your way. But this is kind of a breakdown skeleton of what a study strategy could look like, what my study strategy looked like, what my study strategy literally still looks like as a person who's in my career, right? So like I'm a teacher, so yeah, there's probably more like, you know, school-esque prep going on, but like I feel like for any profession, if you are in a career and not just like a blue collar 9-to-5 job, you are having to continue to learn. You continue to learn, and the better you are at it with your brain, the easier it is. And you can build that skill, you can build that strength, you can exercise this muscle. So check that out, and please email me if you have any specific questions that you do not feel like sharing in our new discussion board, which I just made, where we can share tips and tricks and study resources. If you have a really cool flashcard app that you use and you really like, or an anatomy app or whatever that you want to share, please share it with the whole class so that we can all benefit from that. Let's help each other out. And if you have any questions about the material or about how to study or anything at all, life in general, feel free to share here, and I'll check back with you guys on this, okay? Your other discussions, by the way, I went ahead and extended the due dates to the end of the semester. So basically from here on out, I'm just going to make our little discussion assignments semester-long things. So I know this has been kind of a confusing, weird experiment. I've been really trying to be very lenient with the grading and everything because of this. It's basically like you get the point where you don't. And at this point, especially, you know, you can't be late unless the semester is over. So you have until the end of the semester to do discussions. I will post more discussions with a possibility for a little bit of extra credit. Okay, so keep tuning in over here to the discussion, and I'll keep you guys updated on that as well. For this week's to-do list, I want to introduce real quick all the fun stuff that we're going to be doing this week. So this week we're talking about the heart anatomy and physiology. So we broke down cardiovascular system over 3 weeks. Heart, then vessels, then blood. Heart, then vessels, then respiratory, then blood. Okay, so we are starting with heart anatomy, which will be like my lecture, my first lecture. Then we'll talk about heart physiology in my second lecture. On Thursday, we are going to be dissecting sheep's hearts, I believe. And I have lots of cool resources here for you to look at beforehand, okay? So make sure that you're looking at this beforehand, printing out or downloading whatever you think you will like to have with you while you are doing the physical dissection of the sheep's heart. At the very, very, very least, you should have read the chapter, watched the lectures, and watched these 3 videos, which are from My Lab in Mastering, from the study area in My Lab in Mastering, videos about literally dissecting a sheep's heart. So this is like exactly what you're going to be looking at. So watch those. And then we've got some images that I basically put together in a PowerPoint here. This is basically just like all of the structures that you want to try to identify as many of these as you can on your sheep's heart. Okay, so sheep's hearts and human hearts are pretty much identical except for the size. The sheep's heart is smaller, of course. So unlike the brain, there aren't any really major structural differences. Not that there were any major structural differences with the sheep's brain, but with the heart, they're even more similar. So try to identify as many of these structures as you can on Thursday. We'll also have a slide of some cardiac muscle tissue for you to look at. We'll talk about cardiac muscle in today's lecture. And then I also have this worksheet that's literally from the lab manual that was optional for this class. So I went ahead and scanned that in and put this here in case you are the kind of person that really, really wants some direction for the lab. You can print this out and bring it with you. It's basically going to be like, here's a list, here's a picture, identify the things and label the picture, and then some questions. So it's your basic lab worksheet fodder if you're more comfortable with that, okay? So this Thursday is gonna be fun. Today's lectures are gonna be fun. I'm excited. And your lecture assignments, there are 3 of them this week. You have your chapter 18 homework. You also have a PhysioX activity. So that's the My Lab in Mastering kind of simulation thing. And then you have another Labster simulation, an echocardiography simulation. And of course, if you have technical problems with this, try the normal troubleshooting stuff. So make sure that you're using a browser that's compatible. Make sure that you clear your cache, close the browser and open it back up. If you're still having problems with it, contact Labster support and let me know so that if need be, I can extend the due date for you, okay? But make sure that you are, trying to troubleshoot it first, okay? Because usually it's something's pretty simple, usually. I know we've had a couple of weird cases here, whether that's because of antivirus software or what, we have yet to nail down. But let me know, as always, okay? So let's get going. Oh, I did want to show you this one thing. So this is Complete Anatomy. This is an app that you can get on your cell phone, your tablet, or your desktop, laptop. It is paid. This is a paid app. I paid $35. It's the student version. So what you see here is what you would get if you want to invest 35 bucks in this pretty sweet app. It gives you 3-dimensional simulations of pretty much all the body systems and body structures. So I have some heart stuff saved here. These are like my favorites. So I saved all of these under my favorites and I'll go back and refer to them if I think of it during our lecture. But if you are the type of person that likes to have a model to hold in your hand, this might be the closest alternative that we are able to come up with. Okay, so if you're a model person, if you like models, and you can't afford a heart model because those things are expensive, then definitely consider investing $35 for this app. It's a good one. All right, with no further ado, finally, let's get started. Okay, make sure that I did hit record. Thank goodness, that would have been annoying. Okay, chapter 18, the cardiovascular system, or the CVS if you're being really lazy, like I often am, specifically the heart. So we're going to start with heart anatomy stuff. So you'll see a lot of, you'll see heart anatomy over the top of the slides that are heart anatomy. And then when we get on to the next lecture video, this will be heart physiology right here, okay? But for now, for starters, let's look at heart anatomy. Let's identify the characters before we start looking at what they do exactly, right? So in case you didn't know, humans have a 4-chambered heart, right? We have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. And remember that atria are, that is plural for atrium, right? So atrium is singular. And you have 2 ventricles, singular ventricle, okay? So your atria are on the top of your heart, and your ventricles are below the atria. You have a right atrium and a left, a right atrium and a right ventricle, and you have a left atrium and a left ventricle. And remember, this is the patient's left, right? The patient's right and the patient's left, okay? So don't let that fool you, okay? We also consider the heart and the cardiovascular system as a whole as having 2 circuits, okay? So the blood, as it's traveling to and from the heart, is going to be traveling through one of these 2 circuits. One we call the systemic circuit, which literally just means that it's traveling to and from the body, and the pulmonary circuit, which just means that it's traveling to and from the lungs. When you see the word pulmonary, you can usually assume that we are talking about lung stuff, okay? Okay. We're gonna get this, here we go. This is gonna be the one. Lungs, okay. All right, so your systemic circuit, the body circuit, that is going to be the left atrium and the left ventricle, okay? So the left atrium receives oxygenated blood and sends it to the body, okay? The pulmonary circuit is your right atrium and your right ventricle, and it sends blood to your lungs, okay? So your systemic circuit sends blood to the body, and the pulmonary circuit sends blood to the lungs. Okay, so this is kind of specifically regarding the blood that's leaving the heart. Okay. Blood leaving heart. Okay. Systemic, body, pulmonary, lungs. All right. So your heart is located in your thoracic cavity, of course, right? Specifically, it has its own little cavity within the thoracic cavity called the mediastinal cavity. Okay, so the mediastinal cavity, media is in like middle, okay? It's basically in the center of your thoracic cavity, okay? Between your 2 lungs and slightly to the left, right? So taking up a big chunk of your left lung here. It kind of fits in to a notch in your left lung, which is kind of cool. It sits between your 2nd rib and your 5th intercostal space. Okay, so the 2nd rib is somewhere here, and then the space in between your fifth and sixth rib somewhere here. Okay, so just generally speaking, between like the second and fifth rib or sixth rib. It's attached at the base, at the bottom of the heart, I should say, because this might be actually a little bit misleading with some other terminology that we're using later. The bottom of the heart here is attached, it's actually attached to the diaphragm, amazingly. The apex of the heart, which is the pointy bottom tip of the heart, is pointing towards the left hip, okay? So the apex is pointing towards the left hip, right? It's also attached to the thoracic cavity wall right here in the front. So you can actually feel your heart beating against your rib cage if you feel in between like those fifth and sixth ribs. If you can get up in there right underneath your left nipple, you may be able to actually feel the apex of your heart as it hits the inside of your thorax. It's pretty awesome. And your heart, generally speaking, the rule of thumb is that it's about the size of your fist. So I must have a tiny, and I'm sure that it's black, a tiny little heart, right? Because my tiny little hands. All right, and here she is in all of her glory. Obviously a photograph compared to an illustration with all of our stuff labeled here. Let's go through these very briefly, and I might go back to the Complete Anatomy program to get a kind of a more 3D view of this. But from the front, so this is an anterior view, right? From the front, we can see on the outside, on the exterior surface, we can see the right atrium, which is actually this weird, like different looking structure. Okay, so it's kind of this, in this image, you might notice it looking kind of like a weird lobe on your heart, but that is actually the atrium. We can see the auricle of the left atrium. So the terms atrium and auricle will be technically interchangeable for this class. If you were a cardiologist, you would specifically, if you're talking about the auricles of the heart, be referring to a specific part of the atrium in question. So the right auricle is like this, it's like a flap. It's like just a little, it's like basically like the top part of the right atrium. And the auricle of the left atrium is this pouch that kind of wraps around the front. So this is technically the auricle. The left atrium is around back. Okay. You can see the right and left ventricle and see how the right ventricle appears to be sort of like above, and of course to the right, patient's right, of the left ventricle, which is down here, inside, right? From the outside, we can also see the major blood vessels that are where the heart pumps blood to and from the body and the lungs, right? So the right atrium is the first place, as we consider in the cardiovascular circuit and the whole system, it's considered to be the first place. We usually start with the right atrium. It's kind of arbitrary. It goes round and round, but let's just start at the right atrium because it's a good place to start. So the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body, okay? So it's gonna receive blood through the superior and the inferior vena cava. And then it's going to pump that blood down into the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle sends that blood to the lungs to be reoxygenated, okay? So that's why the right side of your heart is considered to be the pulmonary circuit, because it's sending blood to the lungs, okay? The blood goes to the lungs, you have gas exchange, carbon dioxide gets dropped off for you to exhale, and oxygen gets picked up by the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Those red blood cells that now are oxygenated return to the heart through the pulmonary veins here. They go into the left atrium, which contracts and sends that blood into the left ventricle, which contracts and sends that blood through the aorta, which is this huge curved vessel right here. And that is going to basically supply the entire body. So the atrium sends blood to the arms, the head, the rest of the torso, and then it continues down. If I may color code here, this is the aorta continuing down and sending oxygenated blood, which I really should just be better about keeping it a little bit more consistent for you guys. So you'll notice in a lot of illustrations that oxygenated blood tends to be in vessels that are colored red in a lot of medical illustrations. And then deoxygenated blood tends to travel in vessels that are labeled blue or colored blue. That does not mean that the blood itself is red and blue. It's just a way of trying to teach oxygenated and deoxygenated and keeping it like straight in your mind when you're looking at a diagram. So it's just a diagram trying to be helpful. And so this is the aorta continuing down to feed your abdomen and your legs, okay? So you may consider the red and the blue to be oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. However, there are exceptions. So you really, really need to be aware of which blood vessels are, where they are traveling, what direction the blood is traveling through those vessels. You have to know this, okay? So however you need to study this, and there are lots and lots of resources online. The cardiovascular system, blood flow through the heart, Google it and find quizzes. You'll like labeling activities, these are great. Videos are very helpful, but to really quiz yourself, labeling exercises are probably going to be your best bet, or video quizzes that let you like pause, you know, and kind of like go ahead and identify the next structure that the blood is passing through, that type of thing. So deoxygenated blood traveling to the heart from the body. Deoxygenated blood traveling from the heart to the lungs. Right, and this is going to the other lung. And then fresh oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs through here, okay? So the names of these things and what direction the blood is traveling and where the blood is traveling to are all critical for understanding the heart and doing well on your next exams, right? Oops, I missed a thing. This is all going to the body, to the body. Okay. We're going to be looking at this over and over and over again, so try not to stress about it yet, okay? But all of these terms, these structures are going to be important. I will underline the ones that I need you to know for the exam, okay? You need to know the superior vena cava. You have to know the right and left pulmonary arteries, right? Pulmonary going to the lungs. You need to know the pulmonary trunk, which is, again, going to the lungs, okay? We become arteries past the trunk, okay? Trunk to arteries. to lungs. We need to know the pulmonary veins. So these are going to the heart from the lungs. Okay, so pulmonary arteries leaving the heart, pulmonary veins entering the heart. You need to, of course, know your right and left atria, your right and left ventricles. We are going to talk about the coronary arteries and veins, which are the arteries and veins that actually feed the heart muscle, right? So the heart muscle itself also needs oxygenated blood, and it has its own little blood supply. Well, actually, it just sort of like shares blood from the rest of the body, but it has its own arteries and veins associated with the muscle itself. So you do have your little cardiac veins and coronary arteries. Okay. Coronary and cardiac, heart related, okay. The inferior and superior vena cava, the apex of the heart, very important. The aortic arch. And then these branches of the aorta, I don't think I'm going to have you memorize those, but it doesn't hurt to cover my butt in case I do. All right, continuing. We have rotated the heart, and now we're looking at the back of it, okay? So let's return here to my favorites. All right, so you guys are my favorites. All right, so that first image, we were looking at the heart. Let me just zoom out a little bit. I want you to see what we were looking at with this image. Okay, so let's first nail that down. Okay, so it's something like this, right? We've got the aortic arch here. We can see the superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is back here. Okay, but we can't quite see it all from this angle. If they had cut it off, here we go. If they had cut it off a little bit farther down, we would be able to see it like we see it here. We also have the pulmonary veins and the pulmonary arteries. So we've got pulmonary vein. This one has been cut real close here, but pulmonary vein, it would continue all the way out in this direction, and we would see it here if it was cut that long in this image. And then of course we can see our atria and our ventricles, okay? So we've got the right atrium here. This is the auricle of the right atrium. This whole thing is the atrium. I'm not going to ask you to be able to differentiate between auricle and atrium. For us, they will be interchangeable, okay? So we can call this whole thing the atrium. We can call this whole thing the auricle of the atrium. I prefer atrium, okay? Just know that if you see the term auricle, this is what it's referring to, just this kind of lobe or this pouch of this right atrium, okay? So the right atrium is here. You can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are feeding into it, right? That blood then gets pumped into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle sends that blood up here through the pulmonary trunk and then out the pulmonary veins, out each way, that way and that way, one to each lung, right? Once the lung reoxygenates the blood, it returns to the heart via the pulmonary arteries, which if I rotate this, it stops freezing. I'm asking a lot of my computer right now, I know it. I need to delete some stuff. All right, so the pulmonary arteries return the blood to the left atrium, which is actually here. And then this is the auricle of the left atrium. So this funny little chunk right here is the part that we see right here. Okay, that's just the auricle. But the left atrium is this whole thing right here. So this is basically like a pouch that extends the left atrium. It's what's left of the left atrium that you had as a fetus, because you do not use your lungs when you're in the womb, right? So you had to have some differences in your heart to kind of bypass the lungs while the lungs are still developing and there wasn't air for you to be breathing, right? So that's just where that comes from. But this is all considered left atrium. The reoxygenated blood enters here, and then it gets squeezed down into the left ventricle, which is super strong and has really, really thick muscular walls. And when it squeezes, boom, it has to be able to squeeze blood so hard that it'll travel up this aortic arch, out of the branches and all the way down and get to the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes, right? So your heart, your left ventricle specifically, has to be able to pump strongly enough to send that blood all the way up to your head and all the way out to the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes, all the way down to the tips of your toes. See how the aorta arches all the way up here? So these three branches, again, are going to feed your head, your neck, your upper thorax, and your arms. 1, 2, 3. This continues all the way down through your abdomen and then branches into your legs, okay? And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the blood vessels, okay? So there's a little orientation with a little bit of a 3D aspect for you in case that is helpful. So now again, we can see we're looking at the kind of the backside, the posterior view of the heart. So that would be kind of like, let's see if we can sort of orient it the same. Something a little bit like that. Okay, so check it out. These are the pulmonary veins, right? Going into the left atrium, which looks a little bit weird in this image. But I think they're trying to make it look a little bit more like this. So you got them cut really, really close here, but those are the pulmonary veins. It's supposed to be this and this, these guys, going into the left ventricle. From here, we can see the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, which are cut longer here compared to that image. Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, going into the right atrium, right? Make sure that I get all of our terms here. Superior and inferior vena cava, the right, our arteries and veins, pulmonary arteries and veins. The aorta arching back here, and again, that would basically arch all the way down. It would continue all the way down to go get to your legs. And how about our pulmonary arteries here? That's actually a really nice comparison going on right there, okay? So that's all that we're seeing here. We're seeing the vena cava, we're seeing the pulmonary veins, we're seeing the pulmonary arteries, and we're seeing the aorta, okay? So vena cava, deoxygenated blood from the body into the right atrium. The pulmonary arteries, sending that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Your pulmonary veins, accepting that newly oxygenated blood from the lungs into the left atrium. And finally, the aorta, which is going to send that oxygenated blood to the body, to the rest of the body, okay? Left atrium, right atrium, your cardiac vein and coronary arteries, which we can see different portions of because we're looking at the posterior side, right? This, let's see if I can actually get us a nice image of those guys. Well, we got them separately here. So we've got our coronary arteries. So these, again, this is red oxygenated blood. So this is giving blood to the heart. You'll notice that, actually it's a little hard to notice here, but you can kind of see how this one is basically taking blood directly from the aorta, right? So that blood that the left ventricle is pumping to the body, some of that goes into this coronary artery, the right coronary artery, and that actually branches into capillaries to feed the muscle of the heart itself, which is pretty cool, right? This too is actually coming from the aorta, but it's a little bit harder to tell from these angles. All right, and then your cardiac veins take that deoxygenated blood from the heart muscle. So these branches are now taking blood from the muscle and transporting it to the pulmonary artery and basically dumping it out to go with the rest of the blood traveling through the pulmonary artery to the lungs to be reoxygenated. It's pretty cool, pretty great system. Pretty cool here. Or dumping it here into the right atrium, which is already receiving deoxygenated blood from the body through the inferior and superior vena cava. So it just kind of gets dumped out with the rest of it, makes its way to the lungs, and then comes back through your coronary arteries from the aorta. Just kind of siphoning off a little bit there. Very important that it does that, right? Okay. All right. Coronary sinus, posterior vein, of course, our ventricles, and of course, our apex. All right. And here, in case we're weirded out by this, this is the trunk of the aorta right here. These are the branches of the aorta right here. The superior vena cava is kind of collapsed here. The inferior vena cava was cut very, very close as it was here. Your pulmonary veins were cut very close here. And your pulmonary trunk was cut instead of cutting it farther along like we have here, where we have cuts on the pulmonary arteries, here they cut it at the pulmonary trunk. So it's basically cutting it. Let's see, zoom out a little bit. Come on, buddy. Okay, so basically they cut it here instead of cutting it here and here like they did on this image. They cut it at the trunk. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the layers surrounding the heart. So just like all the other stuff that we've talked about so far, even from part A, right? You have your epi, peri, and endomysium covering your muscles. You have a peri and an endosteum covering your bones. You even have a peri and endochondrium covering your cartilage. You've got now a Peri Epi and Myocardium. Okay, cardium, again, of course, as in heart, right? Peri is going to be the outermost, epi is going to be middle-ish, and endo will be interior, okay? So in between the epi and the endo, we have the myocardium, which is literally just the muscle of the heart wall, okay? So that's just what it's kind of a more general term for the muscle part of the heart wall. It's the myocardium. It's because remember myofibrils, that type of thing. What else do we have? I guess we did sarco more for like the sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. sarcomyo muscle, coronary cardiac heart, pulmonary lungs. This is all stuff that you kind of learn as you keep getting exposed to it over and over again. It's basically muscle of the heart, muscle of the heart. Okay, so let's go through each of these layers one at a time, starting with the pericardium. So the pericardium has two parts. You have the fibrous pericardium, and I'll go ahead and color code this because why not? Can't hurt, right? So pericardium will be outermost. Let's start with yellow maybe. Okay, so pericardium has two layers. You have the fibrous pericardium, and then you have the parietal pericardium. So try to break this down for you. The fibrous pericardium is fibrous connective tissue that surrounds the entire heart, the entire outside of the heart. We've got a kind of a good, that's the mediastinum. Can we do pericardium? I know you're here. I know I favorited it. That's okay. Maybe I didn't. We'll just use this. So here's the heart in context. Oh, yep. Within the thorax. Okay. So see it here hanging out, hiding behind your sternum. Here's your thymus hanging out in between your manubrium and your heart, right? The manubrium of the sternum and your heart. This gray substance covering the heart, that is the fibrous pericardium, okay? Notice how it is attaching to the diaphragm, the muscle of the diaphragm. That's pretty weird, right? So that's the fibrous pericardium. It acts as a protective layer, as well as keeping the heart anchored in place inside of the mediastinum. And it actually keeps the heart from overfilling or getting too big, okay? So it's not stretchy at all. It's holding the heart in a sac that if the heart were to try and overfill with too much blood, it can't stretch that much because the sac is constricting it, okay? So that's kind of a safety that this thing provides for you. That's just this, the fibrous part on top. Underneath, you can kind of see how the next two layers are connected here. They kind of wrap around, right? These are the those parietal and visceral serous membranes that we mentioned in part A of the class. You may not remember this, but in your abdominal cavity as well as your thoracic cavity, you have a connective tissue membrane. I shouldn't say connective tissue, it may be epithelial as well, but you have a membrane that is covering your organs, but then it's also, there's also one that's lining your body cavity itself, okay? So the one that's lining the cavity is called the parietal serous membrane, and then the one that's covering the organs is called the visceral serous membrane, okay? So the visceral one is actually covering the viscera, the parietal membrane is lining the cavity, okay? So we're talking here specifically about the mediastinal cavity. You have the parietal pericardium, because that's what we're calling this serous membrane, okay? So pericardium is the specific name that we give for this serous membrane. Okay, and so the parietal part is technically part of the pericardium, and the visceral part that's actually covering the heart, the organ of the heart, is also known as the epicardium. Okay, so you got to split these serous membranes apart here. Okay, so the epicardium is the visceral parietal, or the visceral pericardium, okay? It's also known as the epicardium, okay? The cavity in between has fluid inside the space. This also helps to protect the heart and cushion it, okay? And then the myocardium is going to be your muscle layer, right? So it's going to be the actual heart and muscle. And the endocardium is the layer that is going to be lining the inside of the heart, okay? So this is basically like the lining of the atria and the ventricles, okay? That inner lining, okay? I'm really digging this color coding with this lecture. Don't know if you can tell. Okay, look at this image. So nothing over here has really changed. Just the image has changed and my scribbles went away, obviously. But this is an illustration of these serous membranes. This is true of all your serous membranes, but looking at the heart in particular, imagine that the parietal and visceral layer are basically like a balloon and the heart is the fist that you're kind of like shoving into the balloon. So the visceral membrane becomes the part of the balloon that's right up against the fist or the heart. And the parietal membrane is the one that's lining the mediastinum, okay, the cavity that the heart is sitting in. And in between or inside of the balloon, you have extracellular fluid that acts as a cushion and protects the heart, okay? So we don't see the fibrous pericardium here. We only see the parietal pericardium, part of the pericardium. Then we see the epicardium in the form of the visceral pericardium covering the surface of the heart. And then deep into the heart, we have the myocardium and then the endocardium lining the hollow spaces inside the heart, the atria and the ventricles. Okay, so here's another little close-up to, again, reiterate what we're seeing here. This curve right there is this curve right here, okay? Just to orient you here. And the fibrous pericardium is outside of that, okay? Covering the fluid-filled space here, or the pericardial cavity, if you will. All right. Okay. The myocardium is, of course, cardiac muscle. So let's talk about cardiac muscle. Specifically, how is it different from skeletal muscle, which we learned so much about back in part A. We kind of skipped over cardiac muscle. We talked about the major differences between cardiac and skeletal muscle in part A, but let's get into a little bit more detail about what cardiac muscle looks like. But first, let's review briefly the differences, right? So skeletal muscle, remember, is like long, skinny tubes, right? They're all laying parallel to each other. Cardiac muscle is also long, skinny tubes, but they also branch, okay? So you have branching in cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle has striations, but they do not, there's no, you don't have separate muscle fibers like attaching to each other in the middle of a muscle. It's one fiber from one end of the muscle to the other, continuous. Whereas cardiac muscle have these structures called intercalated discs. So basically the branching cardiac muscle is actually connected to each other at points where one muscle connects to the next muscle. And in between the two muscles, you have what is called an intercalated disc, okay? And this whole thing right here is an intercalated disc. This is a partial intercalated disc, okay? So basically, if you removed whatever muscle fiber, cardiac muscle cell from here, that's what the disc would look like on one end, okay? So you still have, so how about some of the similarities? Okay, you still have striations in cardiac muscle. So both cardiac and skeletal muscle have these striations, those sarcomeres, remember? The actual contractile units with the overlapping thick filaments and thin filaments. We have that in cardiac muscle. We have Nuclei in your cardiac muscle. You have lots and lots of mitochondria in cardiac muscle. Of course, right, we need a lot of energy in order to be pumping 24/7 for 70 years, whatever the average lifespan is, right? We have myofibrils, hence the same sarcolemma stuff. So these muscle fibers might look similar under a microscope if you're not seeing all the branching and stuff. The mitochondria of your cardiac muscle is important because your heart muscle relies on aerobic respiration, which hopefully you also recall from part A vaguely. Aerobic respiration is cellular respiration that requires oxygen, right? And can only be done by your mitochondria. It takes place within the membranes of your mitochondria, right? So you have lots of mitochondria. You have lots of myoglobin, which your skeletal muscle also has, just basically a secondary storage for ATP and oxygen reserves. And then you also use your glycogen and lipids incorporated in the muscle tissue for additional possible emergency stashes of energy in case you need them. If you recall, the sarcolemma of your skeletal muscle is continuous to these T tubules that kind of dive deep into the muscle to allow the action potential, the depolarization, the signal that tells the muscle to contract. It has to travel all along the surface, the plasma membrane of the muscle cell, but it also has to go deep into the muscle cell in order to reach the sarcomeres that are deep inside of the muscle cell at the same time as the ones on the outside, right? Because you want your muscle to contract all at once, at least your muscle fibers to contract all at once. We have the same kind of deal happening with cardiac muscle, except the T tubules are relatively short. The circulatory supply is much more extensive, okay? So you have capillaries throughout that are going to be from, again, remember those cardiac veins and coronary arteries supplying blood to the actual muscle of the heart itself, the cardiac muscle, as well as removing deoxygenated blood from the cardiac muscle itself. The cardiac muscles are not voluntary, right? That is a major difference that I should have mentioned right off the bat, but which is pretty intuitive. You don't have control over your heartbeat. For the most part, this is all involuntary, so they contract without instruction from the nervous system. And like I said, we have intercalated discs. Okay, so that's really kind of the major one there. Okay, so make sure that you can identify a nucleus within cardiac muscle. Unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is not multinucleate. So skeletal muscle has lots and lots of nuclei in each muscle fiber, which is totally weird. But cardiac muscle is normal. It only has one nucleus per muscle fiber, but lots and lots of mitochondria, same as skeletal muscle. Okay. All right. The intercalated discs are what's really kind of important here. Okay. So here's a little close-up, basically in the side view of an intercalated disc. So like this might be an intercalated disc that hasn't been torn apart like this one has, right? So if we're going to zoom into this, say, you might have something that looks a little bit like this. So how is the intercalated disc strong enough to keep the heart from tearing itself apart? Well, you use desmosomes. Remember in your cell junctions, the things that keep adjacent epithelial cells together, those desmosomes, they're the spot welds, remember? So you have desmosomes like this little guy, basically welding the ends of those two muscle fibers together. You also have what's called fascia adherence. This is connective tissue that connects the cells, very important. So the myofibrils, which are the fibers of the within the muscle cell, right? So basically, that's a muscle cell. That's a muscle cell. These are the myofibrils. Then you're going to have, I should actually say, no, this is a myofibril. This is a myofibril. So you have connective tissue, which we call fascia adherens, literally fibrous connective tissue holding the actual myofibrils together, which allows the cells to pull together more strongly and efficiently. Very important. They all need to work together. And then also very, very important are gap junctions. Okay, so your gap junctions are going to, these are another cell junction, right? And these are the ones that actually form a tube from one cell to the next. So you have a direct communication between two cells, right? We need this, it's very important because you need for the electrical signal for the heart to beat, for your atria and your ventricles to contract, you need that to be consistent across the musculature of the heart. So these gap junctions allow that signal to go from cell to cell really fast. Super important. And another image, this one's from your text actually, a microscopic image of cardiac muscle, which you can differentiate from skeletal muscle because of mostly these intercalated discs. Okay, skeletal muscle will not have these weird lines, little hard random lines. You also will not see the kind of branching that you see here, right? Your skeletal muscle will be one long tube. That's one skeletal muscle cell. A skeletal muscle cell, a cardiac muscle cell, excuse me, it might be that. From here to here, that might be a cardiac muscle cell. It's branched. Okay, more branching. Here's a nucleus. Here's the endoplasmic reticulum. We have the same kind of process with the calcium being released and causing the actual contraction. So the physiology of that is very similar. The T-tubules are a little bit shorter, but you still have your sarcomeres with your I bands, A bands, Z discs, thick filaments, thin filaments, all this stuff that we learned in part A, okay? So go back and review that if you need to. Basically add that this stuff is, the cardiac muscle is branched. It is uninucleate, one nucleus per cell. You have intercalated discs holding different cells together. Some intercalated discs right here and right here. Okay. Still lots of mitochondria. You still have a endoplasmic reticulum that is specialized to store and release calcium to cause the contraction. You still have T-tubules, but now we've got desmosomes and gap junctions in the intercalated discs holding the cells together and allowing them to communicate. Okay. All right, the inside of the heart. Let's talk about the inside of your atria and your ventricles, namely the valves, your heart valves, super important. So you have, so to orient you first, right? You've got your right atrium opened up here. You've got your left atrium opened up here. You've got your right ventricle opened up here. You have your left ventricle opened up right here. And you will notice that between the atria and the ventricles, you have valves, very, very important valves, right? They are this guy right here, which is called the tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve. And you have this guy right here, which is the mitral or bicuspid valve. These two valves are also known as your atrioventricular or AV valves, okay? Because they separate an atrium from a ventricle. Atrium, ventricle. Tricuspid, because it has 3 cusps. I'll show you a picture. And mitral or mitral, not sure the origin of that word, or bicuspid because it has 2 cusps instead of 3. Those are both your atrioventricular valves. Your right atrioventricular valve is your tricuspid, and your left atrioventricular valve is your mitral valve, okay? We have two other valves, right? One is your pulmonary valve, which is the valve in between your right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, okay? And the, kind of hard to see here, but the aortic valve, which is right here. These two guys are called your semilunar valves, or SL valves, okay? All right. Okay, so blood comes into the right atrium from the superior and inferior vena cava. Once it's in the right atrium, it's going to contract, that atrium will contract and open up this tricuspid valve. It'll force blood down into the tricuspid, or into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The right ventricle contracts. That causes the tricuspid valve to close, okay? It must close because we are forcing the blood up through the pulmonary valve to get to the lungs, okay? We do not want any backflow. That is the point of this valve. The reason why you've got all of this stringy connective tissue down here attaching to the walls of the ventricle is so that this valve doesn't blow out in the opposite direction. So it's basically got strings on the edges or the cusps of the valve itself to basically stop it at close and not let it explode the other way, okay? So we're basically stopping that valve, but making a nice hard stop here so that we don't have any blood backflowing into the atrium after it's gone into the right ventricle. We want to force it this way through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries to the left and right lung. Okay. All right. Once the blood goes into the lungs, it gets reoxygenated and it returns via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The left atrium contracts and squeezes blood down through the mitral. I call it mitral, maybe mitral, mitral, potato, potato. The mitral valve into the left ventricle. And now that we have a cross section of the heart here, check out how thick the walls are on the left ventricle. It's intense. It's really intense. The walls of the atria are really thin because one, they don't move as much blood and they don't move it very far. And two, they have gravity to help them, right? So they don't need to be that strong. Even the right ventricle doesn't need to be that strong. The walls are not as thick because it only needs to force blood to the lungs, which are not really that far away, right? So then the left atrium contracts and sends blood down to the mitral valve into the left ventricle, which has super thick muscular walls. And when that left ventricle pumps, boom, it sends blood out through the aortic valve and up through the aorta to the entire body. And that's why the muscle of the left ventricle is so thick. It has to be very, very strong, right? And then the mitral valve does the same thing. As the left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve will be closed. It also has chordae tendineae, which is the name that we give for these little strings. Are we not labeling it here? I guess not, but that's also chordae tendineae there, which keeps that valve from exploding in the opposite direction and creating backflow. No backflow, right? This one snaps closed, forcing the blood up through the aortic valve and up through the aortic arch and the branches and then to the body. Okay, very, very cool. So this chordae tendineae these heartstrings, if you will, they are your literal heartstrings, which is kind of sweet, right? They attach to the inner wall of the ventricles on what is called papillary muscle, okay? The papillary muscle, which is basically like this guy and this guy in that part of the image, and this guy and this guy and this guy in that part of the image. They're basically just like these sort of lumps on the inner surface of the ventricle that the chordae tendineae are attached to. And that's where the chordae tendineae anchor so that when the valve closes, it can't close and basically explode in the opposite direction. It just gets stopped by the chordae tendineae coming off of the cusps. The chordae tendineae are anchored here in the papillary muscle, which when the ventricle contracts, also contract and basically just help to like rein in the power of the blood being pumped past the mitral valve, but through the aortic valve, okay? So we've got our valves here, very, very important. Let's take a look at our valves in a more three-dimensional view. How about this one? Ooh, okay. Let this load here for a second if it's gonna be picky about it. I bet Jason's in there watching Netflix and that's what's slowing me down. I'd like to have a cross section, but this is kind of cool. So I'll show you in cross section in a second, but if you have the right atrium, you've got your tricuspid valve in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, right? When that tricuspid valve closes as the right ventricle contracts, the blood will be forced up through this, the pulmonary valve. Okay, so this is the pulmonary valve here. And then when the blood returns from the lungs, goes into the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to force the blood out through here. This is the aortic valve. So these are our semilunar valves right here. Let's see if we can get a better look at our atrioventricular valves. Okay, that's nice. This is nice. All right, so here we're looking specifically at the right ventricle opened up, okay? So we can see our tricuspid valve. We can see our chordae tendineae, our heartstrings. We can see the papillary muscle that the chordae tendineae are embedded in or anchored in, right? So when this closes, the chordae tendineae keep it from going any further, keep those edges from going any farther. So they just stop and close and seal that off so that the blood can be forced up through here, the pulmonary valve, to go into the pulmonary trunk and out the pulmonary arteries. Let's see if we've got the left side, left ventricle. Oh yeah, here we go. Ooh, and here on the other side, we have, of course, our mitral valve, which is in between our left atrium and our left ventricle. Trying to get a better rotation here. It wants to flop on its side. That's okay. We can see the chordae tendineae, which is anchored in the papillary muscle. That's what this is supposed to be right here, just in the wall that has been removed. That's just the papillary muscle in the wall that's been removed here. And when the mitral valve is shut, it forces the blood up through the aortic valve, which we can just barely see here, right? Which leads up here into the aortic arch right here, right? Pretty cool. Left atrium, anterior coronary arteries. The conducting system. We'll talk about that when we get into the physiology. Okay. All right, so here are the things that you need to know about the internal anatomy of the heart. You need to know your, oh, I guess this is just one side here. Oh, okay. So starting on the right side, I'm just gonna go through the flow again because why not? It can't hurt, right? So you have deoxygenated blood, indicated by the blue vessels here. Superior and inferior vena cava. This is coming from the body, right? That blood enters the right atrium. You need to know the order of these structures too. So what I'm talking about right now is something that you need to have down, pat, okay? The right ventricle contracts, forcing blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts and sends this blood through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, which send blood to the lungs. The left lung and the right lung. That blood then returns to the heart through the left and right pulmonary veins. So this is literally coming from the right lung. This is coming from the left lung. I don't know why lung is so hard for me to write on this thing, but whatever. It travels into the left atrium, goes through the mitral or bicuspid valve. The left ventricle then contracts. The mitral valve snaps closed, and the blood is forced up through the aortic valve, up through the aortic arch of the aorta, and out to the body. Okay. I'm going to redesign this part of the PowerPoint because that doesn't make any sense. Okay. Oh, oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of mixed up. But this way you can see a flow of deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood. It is kind of cool here. All right. Just want to reiterate and show you another view of this left ventricle and how thick the walls are in this image. This is an image from your textbook compared to the relatively thin walls of the right ventricle, because the right ventricle only pumps blood to the lungs and the left ventricle has to pump blood to the entire body. So it has to be much stronger. All right, next up, heart physiology. Oh, but first, okay, so this is basically just another way of looking at all the different structures, including now our little electrical system of the heart, your natural pacemakers, right? These are basically not really ganglia, but they're little places, little like gathering places for nervous tissue on and inside of the heart, which coordinate the heartbeat. So it's a very intricate coordination between the atria contracting and then the ventricles contracting, the atria contracting and then the ventricles contracting. It has to happen with really good timing because you don't want them all to be contracting at the same time because that's not helpful. You want to make sure that you get the maximum amount of blood out of the atria and into the ventricles before the ventricles contract, right? This is important. So this is basically, I'm going to look at this again. I have this further along in the PowerPoint, so don't try and memorize it all right now. But the Cyanoatrial Node, which is located here on the outside of the right atrium, is the first to receive the signal from the brain, from your brain stem specifically, right? And that is what, where the signal for your atria to contract comes from. And then the AV node, the Atrioventricular node, because it's located here in between the atrium and the ventricle. This little guy basically holds the signal and releases it to the ventricles when the timing is right, which is pretty cool. All right, so you've got those two nodes, which we'll talk about more with the physiology. Here's another picture of your valve. So this is a picture from a superior point of view, okay? So you can see your two atrioventricular valves, your tricuspid, 1, 2, 3, and your bicuspid, 1, 2, or the mitral valve here, and your aortic valve and your pulmonary valve, otherwise known as your semilunar valves, okay? Semilunar valves, AV, atrioventricular valves. Very cool. Here's a nice picture of your chordae tendineae holding the flaps of one of your valves here, the tricuspid apparently, and the papillary muscle anchoring them to the wall of the ventricle, the right ventricle in this case, okay? So you may have the opportunity with your sheep's heart to cut away enough to be able to see all of these valves, and hopefully we will, and you should. And then this is again reiterating, this is an image from your text, which you might find helpful, reiterating the blood flow through the heart, okay? And the order in which these valves open and close, okay? So the atria receive blood, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body, the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. The atria contract, they both contract at the same time. The right atrium sends that deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle, while the left atrium sends that new oxygenated blood into the left ventricle. And then when the AV node says so, the ventricles, both ventricles will contract at the same time. When that happens, the tricuspid and the mitral valve are forced closed and not allowed to explode in the opposite direction thanks to the chordae tendineae. And the blood is instead forced up into the coronary trunk through the coronary valve in the case of that deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle. And the oxygenated blood in the left ventricle at the same time gets pushed up through the aortic valve and up into the rest of the body, okay? So here's basically your little valve opening and closing, and your AV valves opening and closing. Here's your chordae tendineae holding the valve nice and closed, but not letting it turn inside out, if you will, okay? No backflow, no backflow, very important. All right, finally, I wanna mention again, your coronary blood vessels, okay? So you do have your veins, which take deoxygenated blood away from the actual heart muscle and basically just dump it into the vena cava to go back through the heart and back to the lungs and come back into the heart and then out to the rest of the body via the aorta. And then it siphons some of that blood from the aorta so that the actual heart muscle can be fed by some of that oxygenated blood, which is pretty cool. The ones that I want you to be able to recognize, ideally identify on a sheep's heart, although I don't know how cleaned up it will be by the time we get them. Your sheep's heart may have the pericardium removed and it may have these blood vessels tampered with, hopefully not, but in either a good example of a sheep's heart or in an image like this, more likely in an image like this, you will need to be able to identify the, I guess I better color code this too, right? The great cardiac vein, because it's so great. The coronary sinus is basically where the blood empties out into either the right atrium or the vena cava. Not as worried about the small cardiac vein, but maybe doubtful. I want you to know that. And then you've got your right coronary artery and your left coronary artery. And these ones you can identify because they start from the aorta. So they're taking some of that oxygenated blood from the aorta and using it to feed the heart, okay? And arteries are feeding oxygenated blood to the heart. The veins are taking deoxygenated blood away from the heart, okay? And the rest of these things, maybe the anterior atrioventricular artery, interventricular artery, so it's between, it runs between the two ventricles. That's really, I think that's really it. Oh, the one other thing that I forgot to mention, which is very important, you must know the interventricular septum, which is just the wall in between the two ventricles, okay? So this structure right here is the interventricular septum, okay? The interventricular septum is the wall between the two ventricles. I'll go ahead and identify it in all the places that I should have identified it, but this is a very important term, interventricular septum. Okay, I think that covered it. Anything else in here that we need? Of course, our valves, our veins, our pulmonary veins, our pulmonary arteries, our vena cava, superior and inferior, the papillary muscle, the chordae tendineae. Trabeculae carneae is basically just the weird lumpy structure of the inside of the ventricles. Don't worry about it. Of course, our cardiums, our connective tissue layers, epi, myo, and endo, which we can see here, but removed we have the pericardium, which includes the fibrous pericardium as well as the parietal pericardium. Don't forget your aorta, your mitral valve. And that's really all that I'm worried about here. If you're curious, the fossa ovalis, this is also like a bypass for fetal blood when you are, or it was, it's not, there's no hole there. There should not be a hole there. In some people there is, and that's a problem, needs to be surgically corrected after you're born. But in the fetus, this is open and allows for the blood to travel freely between the two atria because it gets oxygenated from the umbilical cord and not from your lungs because you don't breathe when you're in the womb. All right. Oh, and this is also the interventricular septum because it's the wall in between the two ventricles. All right. Okay, you guys, from here, we will go into physiology in the next lecture. So stay tuned and I will see you over there. Catch you on the flippity flip.